They said unification would bring peace. They said the warring chaos of China's feudal age would finally end beneath one throne, one emperor, one law. But peace was never what the first emperor sought. What he wanted was silence, the kind that comes only after the last scream fades. When Qin Shi Huang rose to power, he did not inherit a nation. He built an empire out of bones and ash. His rule began not with celebration, but with executions. From the moment he declared himself Shi Huangdi, the first divine emperor, the world around him was reordered. Loyalty became a currency, disobedience, a death sentence. His vision of unity was carved with the blades of soldiers who had long forgotten the difference between discipline and cruelty. Imagine standing in one of those conquered states watching the banners of Qin rise over your city's walls. The air thick with smoke, the bodies of rebels piled in squares as warnings. The people called it peace, but it was the quiet of graves. The P word. Emperor's new order didn't ask for faith. It demanded obedience. Entire families were executed for a single whispered complaint. Words themselves became weapons, and silence became survival. The Qin administration functioned like an iron lung. Every breath of life in China was forced through the emperor's will. His ministers feared even the rhythm of their own voices, for a misplaced phrase could be interpreted as treason. The new legal code was absolute, a machine of terror that transformed crime into ritual punishment. A thief could lose his hands, a dissenter his lineage. To question the emperor was not rebellion, it was suicide. But what truly set Qin Shi Huang apart was not his brutality. It was his belief that fear could purify. In his mind, terror was not evil. It was a cleansing fire. He believed that to build something eternal, he must first destroy what was human. Compassion, memory, freedom. All of it had to be stripped away until only the empire remained. The people he ruled ceased to be citizens. They became instruments of order, extensions of his paranoia. And so the legend of the Qin dynasty began, not as a triumph of civilization, but as a shadow rising over the ruins of 7 kingdoms. Behind the polished bronze of imperial decrees, blood seeped through the cracks of the empire's foundation. The scribes would later write of progress, of roads and walls and unity. They would not write of the mothers executed for mourning their sons, or the generals burned, alive for hesitating before the emperor's command. The first emperor's dream was eternal, but its heartbeat was terror. Every monument he raised, every stone, every soldier, every law, was a declaration that fear was the truest bond between ruler and subject, that no empire could endure without cruelty, that peace itself must bleed. And as the empire expanded, so did the silence. So before we move on, what do you think? Could an empire built on fear ever survive its own shadow? If this story already chills you, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Would you have survived under the first emperor's rule? Power for Qin Shi Huang was not enough. It had to be sanctified. He saw himself not as a man ruling over men, but as a divine force rewriting the fabric of the world. In his court, mortals spoke his name as if invoking a god. Ministers bowed until their foreheads split. His word did not guide the empire. It was the empire. And every law, every punishment, every silence that followed sprang from this illusion of divine order. To sustain this illusion, he built a system of control that bled into every layer of society. Surveillance became sacred. Informants became priests. The empire watched itself with fanatical devotion, a labyrinth of spies feeding reports into the emperor's insatiable fear of betrayal. No one, not even his closest advisors, slept soundly. Rumors alone could destroy entire clans, and loyalty was measured not by deeds, but by how quickly one turned against a neighbor. Behind the gilded doors of Xianyang's palace, the emperor's council functioned like a congregation of terrified worshippers. His chancellor, Li Si, crafted a bureaucracy so intricate that it erased individuality itself. Citizens were categorized, monitored, recorded, reduced to numbers that could be erased as easily as they were written. To question an order was to reject the emperor's divinity. To disobey, even slightly, was to sin against the very concept of existence as defined by Qin law. The emperor's punishments were not random acts of cruelty, they were sermons. Executions were staged as lessons in divine justice. Families of traitors were exterminated to the 9th degree, ensuring that no bloodline could carry the stain of disobedience into the next generation. The empire itself became a theater of devotion, where fear was worship and obedience was salvation. And yet, beneath this ritualized terror, the machinery began to eat itself. Officials desperate to appear loyal fabricated conspiracies to destroy rivals. Whole provinces descended into cycles of accusation and death. The emperor's dream of perfection twisted into paranoia so deep that he no longer trusted his own shadow. He would change his sleeping chambers nightly, surrounding himself with decoys and assassins disguised as guards. The line between loyalty and survival blurred until both became meaningless. The most disturbing part of this transformation was not its brutality but its efficiency. Every cog in the imperial machine moved with mechanical precision, each life calculated to serve the god emperor's immortality. It was a perfection forged in agony, a mirror reflecting not divinity, but the emptiness of absolute control. In the end, the empire no longer needed to be commanded. It simply obeyed, because obedience was all that was left. The flames began as whispers, quiet, cautious, like the first breaths before a storm. They spread from the capital, outward, consuming not just paper but memory itself. Qin Shi Huang had decreed that all books not sanctioned by the throne were to be destroyed. Philosophy, poetry, science, all of it was treason if it spoke of a world before him. And so, under the black banners of the Qin, the past was sentenced to death. The night of the first burning was said to have glowed brighter than the moon. Scholars stood by helplessly as their life's work turned to smoke. Bamboo scrolls, painstakingly inscribed over decades, were hurled into the inferno. History, centuries of it, crackled, hissed, and vanished into the wind. The emperor's agents moved from city to city, rooting out libraries like executioners seeking heretics. To possess a banned text was to forfeit one's life. To quote an ancient master was to confess rebellion, but the flames were not enough. The emperor wanted silence, not merely destruction. Hundreds of scholars were rounded up, men who had memorized the forbidden words, who could still speak the thoughts he had tried to erase. They were interrogated, tortured, and finally buried alive. Some resisted until their last breath, reciting verses of Confucius as the soil swallowed them whole. Others begged for mercy, offering to serve the empire that had condemned them. The earth itself became their tomb, their voices muffled beneath the very ground they once taught upon. Li Si, the chancellor who had engineered the purge, justified it as an act of purification. He claimed that intellectual chaos had poisoned the state, and that unity required the destruction of divergent thought. But in truth, it was fear. Fear that words could outlive the emperor, that ideas could challenge eternity. And so, the empire sought to amputate memory itself, to sever every connection between man and history. In the aftermath, the Qin capital became eerily quiet. The markets still bustled, the soldiers still marched, but something vital had been extinguished. The people spoke in half-sentences, their eyes flicking toward the nearest guard before daring to finish a thought. It wasn't just books that had burned. It was trust, imagination, and hope. The world became narrower, smaller, shaped only by what the emperor permitted it to be. Yet irony, as history loves to remind us, endures even in ashes. The very act of destruction preserved the legend. The burning of the books became the empire's most enduring story, a fire that could never be extinguished, because it burned in memory, not parchment. and somewhere hidden away in a cellar or a distant province a few fragments survived. A sentence, a verse, a whisper of defiance that time itself could not smother. The Great Burning was not the death of knowledge, it was its baptism by flame. For in destroying the past, Qin Shi Huang ensured that his own empire would forever be remembered as the one that feared memory most. In the heart of the Qin court, fear no longer screamed. It whispered. It slithered through the marble corridors and clung to every echo of the emperor's voice. The bureaucracy, once the proud engine of a unified empire, became a graveyard of men who spoke too loudly or too late. What history calls administrative reform was, in truth, a slow execution, an unending purge that hollowed out the empire from within. The process was elegant in its cruelty. Every official, from the highest minister to the humblest clerk, was required to report on the loyalty of others. Suspicion became policy. Betrayal became duty. The emperor's inspectors traveled across the provinces carrying sealed orders that could unmake a career or a life with a single stroke of the brush. To receive imperial attention was no longer an honor. It was a sentence. Those who hesitated were branded unworthy of the Qin vision. The punishments were meticulously designed to break the will before breaking the body. Some were paraded through the streets in cages, their tongues cut out to silence their false words. Others were forced to watch their families executed before their eyes, so that even their final expressions could be read as confessions. No one dared to intervene. To speak in defense of the condemned was to share their fate. In time, the empire learned to breathe differently. Every gesture became measured, every word rehearsed. Ministers bowed lower, soldiers saluted longer, and scribes wrote slower, terrified that an errant mark might be misread as dissent. The administrative purge did not simply eliminate corruption. It eliminated personality. What remained was an empire of shadows, men without conviction, moving only when the emperor's will demanded it. And in that silence, the empire's soul began to rot. Orders were carried out without question, even when they defied logic or morality. Provinces starved because no one dared to report shortages. Roads went unbuilt because no one wanted to be accused of inefficiency. The machine of fear had achieved perfection. It ran without the need for truth. Only obedience mattered. The tragedy was not only in the deaths but in the transformation. Those who survived became ghosts in human skin, faces void of expression, voices trained to repeat what the emperor wished to hear. When Qin Shi Huang looked upon them, he saw loyalty. But what he had really created was emptiness, an empire that would obey him to the end and collapse the moment he was gone. So tell me, what kind of silence is more terrifying, the one imposed by fear or the one chosen by those too afraid to speak? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you would have done standing in that hall of trembling men. There were no iron bars in the prisons of Qin, only fear. The true walls were built inside the mind, forged through pain so exquisite that even truth itself bent beneath it. The empire's justice system, perfected by Li Si's legal code, was less about guilt or innocence than control. Every confession was a performance, every punishment, a message. The goal was not to correct behavior, but to remind the living that their bodies did not belong to them. They belonged to the emperor. The dungeons beneath Xianyang were said to be endless. Narrow corridors soaked in blood and whispers, chambers designed not merely for restraint but revelation. Prisoners were stripped of everything, clothes, names, even memory. They were interrogated by officials who spoke softly, methodically, recording each broken word as imperial proof. Torture was not seen as cruelty. It was administration. Pain was the empire's handwriting. There were devices, terrible, ingenious devices. Wooden racks that stretched limbs until bones snapped. Iron presses that crushed ribs slowly, keeping the victim alive long enough to recite their guilt. Heated needles slid beneath fingernails to make the smallest confession sound like prophecy. And above all, The silence, because screams were not permitted to reach the surface. The Qin prided themselves on order, even in agony. But the most horrifying truth was that many of these prisoners had no crimes to confess. They were victims of quotas, names on lists that needed to be filled. Officials were expected to produce results. A lack of traitors was itself suspicious. And so, ordinary men and women disappeared into the labyrinth, their only sin being too invisible to notice. They emerged, if they emerged at all, as examples, mutilated, branded, tongueless, proof that even innocence was dangerous under heaven's first emperor. The psychological reach of these prisons extended far beyond their walls. Entire towns lived under the weight of imagined guilt. Children learned early to control their expressions, to bow deeper, to never meet the eyes of an official. People whispered that ghosts roamed the roads at night, spirits of those who had confessed falsely, wandering in search of the truth they were forced to betray. But in Qin, truth had become irrelevant. The confession was the truth. Once spoken, it became history, and history belonged to the throne. The invisible prisons of Qin were not places. They were a condition of existence. Every citizen lived within them, bound by invisible chains of suspicion and obedience. And in that darkness, the emperor's dream of perfection was realized. No one dared to think freely because thought itself could be interpreted as rebellion. The empire had succeeded in imprisoning the mind. There are records, fragmented, censored, that claim some of those dungeons were sealed after the emperor's death, their prisoners still inside, left to starve in the silence they had once been forced to maintain. Perhaps that was mercy. For in a world where truth no longer mattered, silence was the only freedom left. Before the emperor's walls rose, before the great tomb was carved, before the empire's seal was burned into the earth, there were the armies. Legions of men whose names would never be written, whose faces would vanish into the dust of conquest. They were the silent architects of Qin glory and the first victims of its perfection. When Qin Shi Huang set out to unify China, he unleashed a military machine the world had never seen. His generals, disciplined and ruthless, obeyed orders carved in blood. Entire provinces were razed to prove loyalty. The emperor believed that mercy weakened unity, and that only through annihilation could order be born. So the armies moved like storms, methodical, unstoppable, faceless. The soldiers fought not for gold, not for glory, but for survival. Conscription was absolute. Farmers were taken from their fields, sons from their mothers, husbands from their homes. To refuse was treason. To hesitate was death. They marched under banners of black silk, their armor lacquered in ash, chanting hymns to a ruler they would never see. Behind them, executioners followed, to ensure the army advanced, even if it meant walking over the bodies of their own. The Great Unification was not a campaign, it was a cleansing. Cities that resisted were obliterated. Those who surrendered were enslaved, their craftsmen forced to build roads, palaces, and tombs for the empire's glory. After victory, the soldiers who carried out these purges were often executed themselves. Their blood used to sanctify the conquered soil. It was said that the emperor trusted only the dead. In one campaign against the state of Zhao, the Qin captured over 400,000 enemy soldiers. They were promised mercy. Instead, they were buried alive in trenches that stretched for miles. The ground trembled for days as thousands suffocated beneath the weight of dirt and empire. The Qin called it pacification. The survivors called it the silence of hell. And yet, history forgot them. Their bones became foundations for walls and fortresses. Their blood mixed with the mortar of a nation that celebrated its invincibility. The emperor's scribes erased their suffering, replacing it with words like unity, order, and peace. But the land remembered. The soil of China still holds those memories, the unmarked graves of perfection. For Qin Shi Huang, victory was not about the living. It was about monuments that would outlast them. The Great Wall, the imperial roads, the mausoleum, each stone laid by hands that trembled from exhaustion, the same hands that would later be severed to ensure they never built again for another. Perfection, in the empire of Qin, demanded sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice was not death, it was disappearance. The armies that forged the empire were erased from its story, their silence mistaken for loyalty. But in truth, they were not soldiers of unity. They were offerings, given to a god who demanded blood to prove his divinity. And so the emperor stood alone atop his world, surrounded by monuments made of bones, declaring his empire eternal, while the wind carried the whispers of the forgotten dead across the fields they once marched. Not all executions ended with death. For many, the Qin Empire's cruelty was far more patient. Those who were not killed were sent into exile, living ghosts condemned to build the emperor's monuments with their own decay. These were not exiles in the romantic sense of banishment, but of obliteration. They were erased from family records, stripped of names, and marched toward the edges of civilization to die beneath the weight of stone. It began with the Great Wall, the emperor's obsession with eternity. Hundreds of thousands of convicts, peasants, and prisoners of war were conscripted to construct it. The empire called them reform laborers. In truth, they were sacrifices. Chained together, driven through deserts and frozen mountains, they laid each brick under the lash of overseers who were often exiles themselves. The wall was built not just from stone, but from flesh. When a worker collapsed, his body became part of the foundation. The Qin had no need for graves. At the same time, others were sent south to carve canals, or west to mine mercury and jade for the emperor's afterlife. They were called the condemned builders. No one returned from these journeys. The empire's records claimed they completed their service, a phrase that meant nothing more than vanishing into exhaustion and dust. The great projects of Qin became mass graves disguised as triumphs. Families left behind were forced to pretend they did not mourn. To weep for an exile was to admit he had existed, and existence, once erased by the emperor's decree, could not be acknowledged again. Mothers whispered prayers into their sleeves. Wives placed offerings at night unseen, terrified that the smoke of incense might betray them. Even grief was outlawed. There were reports, later buried, like the workers themselves, of entire work crews sealing themselves inside the wall rather than continue. 1,000 men, entombed alive by their own hands, believing that death as a group would spare them the humiliation of being forgotten one by one. The empire never recorded it, but the stones did. Travelers centuries later claimed to hear cries when the wind struck certain sections at night. This was the engineering of suffering, the transformation of human life into imperial architecture. Qin Shi Huang believed these projects would grant him immortality, that his name would echo through eternity. He was right, but not for the reasons he imagined. His monuments endure not as symbols of unity, but as the graves of the nameless, the proof that perfection is built only on pain. And you, yes, you watching, what do you think? Were these people victims, or builders of their own doom? Tell me in the comments what you'd call them if history had left you among the exiles. For a man who commanded a continent and silenced millions, Qin Shi Huang was terrified of one thing he could not command: death. It stalked him quietly, like a shadow that refused to kneel. Beneath his armor and divine titles, the emperor trembled at the thought of his own decay. He could destroy history, burn books, and erase bloodlines. But he could not erase the clock beating inside his own body. And so began the empire's strangest obsession, the search for immortality. The emperor's alchemists became his priests, promising to distill eternity into a single drop. They mixed mercury with gold, crushed pearls into powder, and spoke of islands across the sea where gods drank from fountains that reversed time. The emperor believed them. He sent ships filled with thousands, scholars, craftsmen, virgins, on voyages to find these sacred lands. None ever returned. Whether they died in storms or simply fled, no one knows. Their absence was recorded as success, for in Qin, even failure served the myth of the god emperor. Within his palace, the experiments grew darker. Animals were sacrificed, then servants. The alchemists tested elixirs that glowed like molten silver, liquid death disguised as salvation. The emperor drank them daily, believing the pain that followed was proof the potion was working. His skin turned pale, his veins darker. His mind, already consumed by paranoia, fractured further. He began to see ghosts. Some said the ghosts of the scholars he buried alive. He ordered new purges, new prayers, desperate to drown the silence of the dead. In his quest to live forever, Qin Shi Huang became less than human. He stopped touching the earth, carried everywhere in sealed carriages so that no impurity could reach him. His voice came only through messengers. His presence was felt but never seen. Even his sons were forbidden to approach. The emperor was becoming what he feared most, a spirit trapped between worlds, existing but not alive. Meanwhile, the empire that fed his obsession began to rot. Crops failed, roads decayed. Soldiers muttered that the heavens had abandoned him. But still he demanded more elixirs, more sacrifices, more proof that eternity could be swallowed. He was not seeking life anymore. He was fleeing death. Every ritual, every experiment, every drop of mercury that slid down his throat was a prayer spoken in terror. When the emperor finally died on one of his endless journeys, his attendants dared not announce it. They sealed his carriage and continued the procession, terrified that news of his mortality would spark rebellion. They filled the cart with rotting fish to hide the smell of his body. Even in death, the god emperor's fear ruled them. Irony buried him before the soil did. In trying to become immortal, Qin Shi Huang poisoned himself with the very elixirs that promised eternal life. His search for eternity granted him only the immortality of infamy, a legacy carved not in stone, but in suffering. He had conquered death only in the cruelest way imaginable, by ensuring his own terror would outlive him. Beneath the soil of Xi'an lies a world that was never meant to be seen by human eyes, a city of the dead, built to mirror the living empire above it, perfect, ordered, eternal. This was the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the emperor's final command, to construct a kingdom that would outlast life itself. And to achieve it, he condemned tens of thousands to vanish beneath the earth, swallowed by the same darkness they were building for him. The project began long before the emperor's death. Rivers were redirected, mountains hollowed, forests cut to the root. The scale was unimaginable. 100 palaces, underground roads, chambers lined with bronze and gold, all sealed away from the light. At the Yaoi center lay the tomb itself, a vast chamber said to hold the emperor's body afloat on a sea of mercury. Ancient texts claim that rivers of liquid metal flowed through the chamber, representing the Yangtze and the Yellow River, forever encircling the man who had claimed to unite them. The terracotta army stood guard around him, an army sculpted from clay, but filled with eerie precision. Every soldier bore a unique face, as if the artisans had captured the souls of real men in fired earth. Some historians believe they did. Workers were executed upon completion to ensure no one could reveal the tomb's design. Their blood was mixed with the clay, their breath sealed inside the statues. Even now, when archaeologists uncover them, traces of red pigment cling to the eyes, once bright, now faded, like the memory of life turned to dust. And there were sounds, according to the legends. When the tomb was sealed, some workers were trapped inside intentionally, tasked with guarding the emperor's spirit for eternity. It's said that their screams were the last thing heard before the stone doors closed. Locals call it the 1,000 voices, the echo of those who built their own grave. What lies deeper remains unknown. Modern technology has revealed high mercury concentrations in the soil, supporting the ancient accounts, but the tomb itself has never been opened, not out of superstition, but fear. Scientists worry that breaking the seal could destroy what's inside or release something far worse. The air within may still be toxic, the mercury still flowing after 2,000 years. Time has made the emperor's paranoia immortal. To this day, the mausoleum remains untouched, a wound in the earth that refuses to heal. Above it, tourists walk through fields that hide the silence of a civilization's sins. They see the statues and marvel at their craftsmanship, not realizing that every one of them is a gravestone. The army doesn't protect the emperor, it imprisons him. His eternal empire of clay has become his cage, his punishment for seeking eternity. The soil of Xi'an breathes softly at night, they say. Some claim you can hear the whisper of the sealed dead when the wind turns cold. Perhaps it's only imagination. Or perhaps the empire still remembers what it was forced to forget. When Qin Shi Huang finally descended into his tomb, the world above began to breathe again. The empire he had built through terror and precision collapsed within 3 years. His monuments stood, but his vision crumbled, proof that even fear has an expiration. The silence he demanded did not die with him. It fractured, echoing through centuries as both warning and prophecy. The collapse began quietly, as all empires do. Without the God Emperor's voice to command it, the machinery of obedience began to seize. Officials trained to follow but never to think were paralyzed. Armies, once unified by dread, turned their swords inward. Peasants rose in revolt, chanting the names of the dead who had built their prisons. The same roads that once carried soldiers of conquest now carried ghosts of rebellion. The empire of perfection dissolved into dust, undone by the very fear that had built it. And yet the legacy endured, not in the monuments, but in the idea that power could outlast morality. Later dynasties studied Qin's methods in secret. They refined his laws, softened his image, but never forgot his lesson. Control through fear works, until it consumes the hand that wields it. The first emperor became both a myth and a mirror. Every ruler who followed saw a fragment of himself reflected in his shadow. Today, archaeologists dig into his past, piecing together fragments of horror from shards of pottery and buried chambers. But history is not only unearthed, it is inherited. The systems of surveillance, censorship, and control that define Qin still echo in every society that values order over humanity. His empire may have fallen, but his design remains, replicated endlessly in different names under different skies. Perhaps that is the true immortality he achieved, not the mercury rivers or the terracotta legions, but the infection of an idea, that peace is best maintained through fear, and that obedience is the price of unity. His body may have turned to dust, but his philosophy lingers, whispering beneath every flag that promises order. And so the question remains, did Qin Shi Huang truly fail? Or did he succeed in the only way eternity allows, by ensuring that his terror became timeless? If you've walked through this darkness with me to the end, you already know, history never buries its monsters, it recycles them. So before you go, make sure to subscribe and leave this phrase in the comments. Even silence remembers. Then prepare for our next descent into another empire where fear built the foundations of eternity.